I was meant to be on a plane to Portland, on my way to my sister's lake house for the holidays. My suitcase was already checked, my boarding pass clutched between my fingers. But just as I rolled into the long-term parking lot, something gripped me, sudden and icy. I had left behind the original will, Arthur's true will, the real document, not the photocopy I kept tucked in the desk drawer. I swung the car around, telling myself I'd be home and back within 5 minutes. I had no idea I was about to hear the one thing no mother should ever be forced to hear. Not inside her own walls. Not spoken by her only child. The front door sighed on its hinges as I eased it open. I didn't call out to hello. The air inside felt unnaturally still, as if even the house were holding its breath. My keys lay cooling in my palm, but I didn't toss them into the ceramic bowl like I always did. Something in my chest went quiet, as though a metronome had stopped ticking. I stepped into the hallway, the soles of my shoes whispering across the wood. Voices drifted from the study, low, measured, deliberate. I paused behind the archway, pressed my back to the wall, breath thin and careful. If she's showing signs, we can make the case, said a voice I knew far too well. Grant, she's 74, another voice replied smoothly. With the right filing, diminished capacity isn't hard to demonstrate, Ash. That was the name. The lawyer Grant had paraded through after Arthur died, under the polite pretense of helping sort Dad's papers. My heart thumped slow and heavy, a drum under wet cloth. I couldn't see them, but the shape of their conversation was so solid I could almost trace it with my fingers. They were talking about guardianship. About me, Grant continued almost clinically. I've already started the list. She's misplacing things, repeating herself. She barely touched last year's taxes. My mouth opened to call his name, to step in and shatter the whispering. Instead, I eased back, careful, unwilling to let a complaining floorboard betray me. Outside, the afternoon sun stayed warm, but inside me everything slid toward frost. I got into the car and sat motionless, staring through the windshield, keys still clamped in my hand. The woman who raised him, who worked graveyard shifts in archives so he could finish college without debt, was being itemized like a record in a box. I pressed my lips together, not from rage, but from a stunned refusal to believe this alignment of facts. That was the instant something in me moved. Not broken, no, not yet, but the heat that lived in my chest shifted, cooling, pulling back the way tide withdraws from shore. And the worst part? It wasn't what I heard. It was the realization of how long I'd been ignoring what I already knew. If you've ever watched your own child turn into a stranger under your own roof, you understand. This was the day I stopped being a mother first and started turning into something else entirely. Let me take you there. I didn't return to the airport. I didn't call my sister. I just kept driving. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my mind floated, untethered. I passed the on-ramp to the interstate and let old instinct pull me through streets I hadn't travelled in decades. When I finally stopped, I was parked in front of a bakery wedged between a laundromat and a faded barber shop. The awning was new, clean lines and crisp fabric, but the fragrance spilling through the open door was identical to the one I remembered. Cinnamon, butter, toasted almonds, the warm grammar of comfort. Arthur used to bring me here every Sunday. Rain or shine, back when we lived in a 2-bedroom off Union Street. Back when Grant was just a boy with scabbed knees and a head sizzling with inventions. Inside, the counter had been swapped for something sleek and glossy, but the tables were still charmingly mismatched, each sporting a tiny vase with defiant, cheerful flowers. I ordered a coffee and took the seat by the window. My fingers cupped the mug, pulling heat into my skin, looking for an anchor in the present. I watched the sidewalk, people bundled in thick coats, heads tucked down, lives moving quickly past mine. I saw Arthur reading the paper at this very table, while Grant engineered towers from sugar packets. As a child, he asked about everything: bridges, trains, elevators, how they worked, why they moved, what held them together. He never wanted a soft answer. He wanted schematics, so I found them. I brought home heavy library books, circled paragraphs in pencil, signed him up for robotics camp before he'd even thought to ask. He had been curious, not entitled, at least back then. Somewhere between that boy and the man I overheard that morning, something shifted. Not in a single crash, but like a kettle forgotten on the stove, First the quiet vapour, then the hiss, then the room filling with a heat you ignored too long. I remembered when he insisted on handling Arthur's estate, told me it was too complicated for me. When he replaced our family accountant with a firm I'd never heard of. When he set my property taxes to auto-pay without asking, I had witnessed the signals but written them off. A tired mother's trust, a widow's reach for hope. Now the pieces flipped and fell into their natural places, like a puzzle that finally gives in to the truth. The picture sharpened. I left the bakery after half the coffee. The taste sat bitter on my tongue, not from the beans but from memory. Outside, the sky had gone grey. I zipped my coat to my chin and stood still on the sidewalk. I wasn't ready to go home. Not from fear, but because I needed to remember the version of me that existed before I let other people tell me who I was. This quiet detour would be my beginning. The parking lot behind the library lay mostly empty by the time I arrived. Late afternoon, winter's soft grey already sliding into place. I pulled into the same spot I used to favour when I worked there, muscle memory wearing the years like a familiar cardigan. In the wind, the big oak by the back door swayed gently. I watched it for a full breath. Inside, it was quieter than my recollection, but the bones were the same. New carpet, updated checkout stations, and yet the smell, ink dust and old wood, was unchanged. That scent made me feel calibrated, competent, whole. I walked past the fiction stacks and headed straight to the back, to the archives room. Almost nothing had changed. The same tall filing cabinets, the same beige lights that flickered if you stared too hard. I nodded to the young woman at the desk and asked to review a document I'd once catalogued, a copy of my husband's will. She didn't interrogate me. She simply slid a clipboard across, pointed me toward the corner table. My hands still knew where to look. I located the folder without effort. It was thick, not because the will was long, but because Arthur couldn't help annotating, margins laced with arrows and dates, tight abbreviations in his uncompromising script. It made sense to him, and over the years, it had come to make perfect sense to me. I laid out the pages and combed through them line by line. The will was intact, no strike-throughs, no sneaky edits. What snagged my eye were the sticky notes tucked in the folder. One read, Dolores. If you ever feel unsure, the answer is always in the numbers. I turned to the final page. There was a neat chart, assets, property, investments, bonds, each with a note. D to retain. D or grant if qualified, legal hold until independent review. And then the part that slammed like a door, not grant to manage, not full access for son. Arthur had been exact. He had trusted me. Heat rose through my chest, not anger, but recognition, memory. The sensation of returning to my own skin after wandering in someone else's sizing. I pulled a notepad from my bag and made a list. First, certified copies. Second, legal counsel. Third, audit of all recent account changes. I underlined each item with slow, steady pressure. When I stepped back into the evening, the sun had already dropped below the roofs. The sky had turned to a thoughtful navy. The cold didn't reach me. I walked to the car with purpose, breath clouding the air, and for the first time in weeks I did not feel old, or muddled, or like a person being managed. I felt like Dolores Whittaker, the woman who kept rare collections in order, who could recite policy without peeking, who once found a Revolutionary War letter trapped behind a stubborn file cabinet, and who would now find her way through this, one document at a time. That next morning, I moved slowly, not because my joints complained, but because I needed the illusion to read as truth. I tucked a small voice recorder into the lining of my wool coat, the same pocket device I used in library interviews, hardly bigger than a thumb, with a soft click that roused the little red light before it sank back down. I left the front door unlocked. The sun had climbed just high enough to draw clean shadows across the kitchen tile. I cut the overhead light, let daylight do the talking. I brewed tea, spilled a bit on the counter, left the kettle barely ajar. Subtle messes, the kind that could be mistaken for forgetfulness. By 10:30, Grant arrived. I hadn't asked him to come. He rarely asked anymore. He preferred to appear. He carried a grocery bag and wore that gentle, deliberate smile he saved for moments when he wanted something. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe, a crossword half filled in front of me, pen missing its cap. I lifted my gaze slowly. He kissed my cheek and remarked that the house felt chilly. I nodded and murmured that I must have forgotten the heat again. I had a tin of crackers. The performance began. "How are you sleeping?" he asked, soft as a glove. "I'm not sure," I said, then drifted mid-sentence into a different topic. I let my hands wobble slightly over the spoon. He offered to warm the soup. I smiled and told him yes, as though granting him a favour. He moved around the kitchen like an inventory clerk, eyes flicking over the calendar, the pills by the sink, the pile of unopened mail. He pointed to a letter from the insurance company. I said I hadn't gotten to it yet. He offered to go through it for me. I pretended I didn't hear. After lunch, he leaned against the doorframe and studied me for a long stretch. When he finally spoke, the words only confirmed everything. He'd been researching care homes, just options, places with gardens, with music therapy, with staff trained in memory care. He said it gently, like it was love wearing a cardigan. I blinked and let a small smile surface. Said maybe it would be nice to have someone else cooking. Then I asked him what day it was. He looked satisfied. As he cleared the dishes, I sat quietly, gazing out the window. The recorder purred on inside my coat, gathering every syllable, every tenderly sharpened knife of a phrase. When he left, I locked the door and went straight to the study. I slid off the coat, set the recorder on the desk. My hands didn't tremble. I sat in the quiet and replayed the conversation in my head, not to brood, but to be precise. Now I had more than memory. I had record. And the silence I had dreaded had turned into my most reliable ally. The next morning, I found Melanie's old number on a yellowed Rolodex tucked behind the cookbooks. We hadn't lost touch out of anger. Life simply folded inward after Arthur died. We worked side by side for 15 years at the university library. She was brilliant, always a step ahead, and had that rare gift for spotting the flaw in a plan while it still looked perfect. I called and left a message. My voice was calm, direct. I told her I needed a legal mind I could trust, and that it was personal. Within an hour, she texted. She'd be at my house by 4. When she arrived, she filled the space without crowding it. Navy wool coat, hair pulled back in a decisive knot. She looked exactly like herself, grounded. No performative softness, no hollow chatter. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured chamomile into mismatched cups. I slid the recorder and a folder across. I didn't decorate the moment with explanations. She listened to the audio straight through. Her face barely shifted. When it ended, she looked at me and said, "We're going to fix this." Her laptop opened like a blade. Fingers moved fast. She asked about my power of attorney, if I'd updated it since Arthur passed. "No," I said. She nodded once. "First," she said, "we revoke Grant's authority. Then we draft a new will, name a trusted executor, and notify the state of the updates." "Everything documented and time-stamped?" She asked about digital backups. I told her I had none. "We'll fix that." Over the next hour, she sketched a plan, clean, quiet, legal. Everything Grant counted on me forgetting, we were about to reframe in writing. Melanie was precise but never cold. She didn't look surprised. She had seen variations of this story before, not always with children, but always with someone who believed proximity meant possession. We moved into the den. She scanned Arthur's annotated will, helped me set up encrypted cloud storage, created a folder labelled with librarian's clarity, Dolores, legal, private. She explained update protocols, where to put medical reports, which versions to preserve and how to name them so they could never be misread. Before she left, she placed a single piece of paper in front of me, a formal revocation of power of attorney. My name, his name. The date I signed. She slid it into her briefcase. "This is the first step," she said, simple, steady. After she left, I sat by the window watching the bare dogwood branches stir in the wind. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the hollow quiet I'd come to dread. It sounded like rebuilding, one decision, one document, one recovered version of myself at a time. And I wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed moved with a deliberate rhythm. Melanie gave me a checklist. By the second morning, I no longer needed to read it. The cadence of self-protection settled into me, the same clean order I'd felt in my early archiving years. when each document had its own story, and my job was simply to preserve it. I started with my medical records. Booked an appointment with Dr. Elkins, my physician for more than a decade. During the visit, I requested a cognitive evaluation, not out of doubt, but for the paper trail. He didn't question the request. He ran the assessment, tested reflexes, reviewed my chart, then handed me a signed letter. Cognitively sound. No signs of impairment. I folded it carefully and slid it into the file folder that now travelled everywhere with me. Back home, I gathered evidence of clarity, grocery receipts, bank statements scribbled with notes in my handwriting, printed emails from the last 2 years. I made lists. I dated every sheet. I sorted them into neat categories: legal, medical, personal. I labelled folders the way I labelled collections: crisp, consistent, unassailable. I scanned each page into my new cloud. Milene had walked me through it twice. Now I could do it in my sleep. The compact scanner she'd lent me was fast and reliable. Every file stamped with a date. Each document another brick in the wall I was building between myself and the diminished version of me Grant hoped to present. In the back of the closet, behind heavy winter coats and an unused suitcase, I unearthed a box labelled Arthur Misk. Inside were letters. Most were domestic fragments from early marriage, grocery lists, reminders, little hearts next to his name. But one slipped loose from the stack, a single page in his broad, steady hand, dated a decade ago. No envelope, just folded into quarters, tucked between 2 travel brochures. If the day comes when our son makes you doubt yourself, it read, trust your instinct. You've always seen clearer than you believe. I sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in my lap. The house held still. My heartbeat evened. Outside, wind brushed the windows like fingertips. Arthur had known. Not the specifics, but the possibility. He had seen something I wasn't ready to accept then. I was ready now. That night, I backed up everything again. Sent copies to Milene. Slipped a flash drive into the safe deposit box. I added a final line to my journal. There's no such thing as over-prepared when someone is trying to erase you. I slept without clicking on the hallway light. For the first time in weeks, I didn't get up to check the locks. The work was underway and I wasn't playing defense anymore. I was documenting my survival in my own hand as it happened. He came by on a Wednesday. I didn't hear the car, just the chime of the doorbell a little after noon. I drew a slow breath and walked to the door, unhurried. When I opened it, Grant stood there with a paper bag in one hand and a small bouquet of supermarket tulips in the other. He smiled, that practiced, soft expression he wore after being caught stealing cookies as a boy. I stepped aside and let him in without commentary. The tulips were a bright, uncomplicated yellow. I thanked him and set them in the old green vase on the dining table. He noted how peaceful the house felt. I said I agreed. He moved into the kitchen and unpacked his bag like he'd never learned to ask. Vegetable soup, a crusty roll, a chocolate bar. I offered to warm the soup. He deflected and did it himself. He has always moved through this room like it belonged entirely to him. We sat at the table. He asked about sleep. I told him some nights behaved better than others. He nodded and wondered aloud whether I'd thought about hiring someone to check in once or twice a week. I said that might not be a bad idea. I let the spoon rest in the broth. My hands worked a fraction slower than normal. He watched me the way a person watches a dial they've just adjusted. Then he drifted into details about places he'd researched. Assisted living with wellness programs, walking paths, private rooms. He said it gently as if it were merely an option. Said I deserved rest, that too much solitude wasn't safe. I traced the napkin's stitched edge and told him I'd consider it. His face softened, relief maybe. When he proposed driving me to tour one next week, I gave him another faint smile and said, perhaps. Then I asked what day it was. He told me, and I nodded as though I'd misplaced it in my head. I let the silence lengthen. He stayed another 30 minutes. Walked the hall as if he were hunting for neglected tasks. Pointed out a flickering bulb in the laundry room and a loose porch rail. I took note of what he noticed. Before leaving, he put a careful hand on my shoulder and said he wanted only the best for me. I set my hand on his and said I knew. As soon as the door clicked shut, I moved to the back window and watched him sit in the car. He lingered, typing into his phone. his mouth shaping silent words like rehearsal. In the study, the small recorder nestled on the bookshelf had been running the entire time. Every sentence, every suggestion, every well-tempered nudge was archived. That evening, I uploaded the file and labelled it with librarian's bluntness, Visit, Grant, Assisted Living Discussion. The performance was almost flawless, not because it needed a makeover, but to tuck a second recorder beneath the side table. Placement mattered. He tended to pace near the window whenever nerves tugged at him, and I wanted the range to catch the porch as well. I tested the angle, checked the pickup, made sure any porch conversation would land cleanly on the tape. I left the front door unlocked again. A deliberate signal of openness, of vulnerability. Then I moved quietly through the kitchen, planting small cues of supposed forgetfulness. I left the refrigerator just barely ajar. I set the measuring cup in the sink, rather than in its cabinet. Passing the hallway mirror, I raked my fingers through my hair so it looked unintentionally mussed. At 10:40, his car rolled up the drive again. He mounted the steps humming a tune easy and light. I stepped onto the porch in a cardigan, pulled tight across my shoulders, and asked what brought him back today. He said he was in the neighbourhood, just checking in. He handed me a fresh packet from the care centre he'd mentioned earlier. I took it in both hands, let my fingers tremble a fraction. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I settled onto the porch swing and asked him the time. He smiled, told me gently, and sat beside me. I glanced at the photography on the brochure and whispered that the grounds looked pleasant. He leaned closer and painted it like a weekend retreat, walking paths, a music room, sunlight across tidy lawns. Then he shifted to the paperwork, mentioned he'd spoken to someone named Ashby, a legal advisor he trusted, someone who could help file whatever documents were necessary. He wanted everything in place, he said, so there'd be no confusion if anything ever happened. I nodded, kept my gaze on the street. His phone buzzed, and he stepped a few feet away to take the call. His voice drifted in through the open window, even unhurried. He said Ashby's name again and used phrases like expedited review and mental competence. He mentioned next week. He said I was close to ready. I sat very still. Not stiff, not theatrical, just quiet. The porch microphone gathered every syllable. He came back with a cup of tea he'd carried from the kitchen. I thanked him and asked whether we'd discussed this the last time he visited. He looked pleased, congratulated me for remembering. Then he asked whether Thursday would work for a tour. I told him I'd consider it. I sipped the tea, let it linger, and said the flavour reminded me of something Arthur used to brew. He offered no response. Only a nod. Said he'd call tomorrow. After he left, I went inside and gently detached the porch mic from beneath the ledge. I uploaded the file and titled it plainly like a librarian, Porch, Call Ashby Expedite Competence next week. That evening, Melanie came by. She set her tablet on the table, and we copied everything to 2 separate encrypted backups. I showed her the notes Grant had scrawled inside the care centre packet. He'd circled an admissions policy line, transfer of medical proxy contingent on observed need. She met my eyes, then slid a folder across the table. Inside a sworn affidavit, my current legal and medical capacity, signed by Dr. Elkins and countersigned by 2 notaries. The board had shifted. Grant believed he was tightening the circle. He didn't realise I was documenting the radius. 3 days later, Melanie delivered a formal response to Ashby's office. The envelope was heavy with its own certainty, the capacity affidavit, the newly notarised power of attorney, the updated will, and a written notice revoking all prior authorisations. Everything time-stamped. Everything signed in duplicate. Not a war cry, but a shield. She didn't email it. She carried it herself, climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor above the dentist's office, and left it with the receptionist, with one request: place it directly in Ashby's hands. Then she walked out. That evening she phoned me. Her voice was steady, though something unreadable hovered underneath. Ashby had called her personally after reading through the packet. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply said he would be stepping away from the matter. And then, almost as an aside, he mentioned that Arthur had once done him a favour when very few people would. Not a confession, but a fracture in Grant's wall all the same. I sat with that call a long time. Then I pulled out Arthur's letter again and followed the last sentence with my thumb. The next day, a courier delivered a letter. Not from Grant. From Ashby. A brief note on firm letterhead stating he would no longer be involved in any legal issues pertaining to my estate. Enclosed, a printed record of all documents filed on my behalf over the last 6 months, including those initiated by Grant. The trail was meticulous. Dates, digital logs, drafts, emails, phrases from our soup and kindness conversations appeared verbatim in a draft declaration of concern attached to a guardianship proposal. There were even template pages for future affidavits, ready for neighbours or friends to confirm observed memory issues. He had been building a silent case, and now I had the blueprint. I called Melanie. We agreed on the next move. She would draft a concise statement of intent to file if any further motion emerged from Grant's side, a warning, not a threat, that any attempt to breach my rights would be treated as legal overreach and elder coercion, and we would put it on the record. That night, I slid Ashby's letter beside Arthur's note in my nightstand drawer. 2 men, one who had tried to render me an outline and eraser, and one who handed me enough light to redraw the lines. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, like I'd finally cleared the holding pattern and found open sky. The house's silence no longer pressed. It stood next to me, a companion, solid and patient. Grant returned without warning, no text, no call. Tyres hissed on the gravel, and the front gate gave its old, slow creak. I'd been expecting it. Ashby's withdrawal had revised the terms, and Grant would come back to reassert control. He walked up the path with a folder under his arm. Measured steps, tight shoulders. The mask of careful concern was still on his face, but stretched thin over something sharper. When I opened the door, I didn't feign surprise. I stepped back and invited him in. He followed me to the kitchen and remarked that it smelled like cinnamon. I'd warmed cider on purpose. He didn't sit. He set the folder on the table and stayed standing as if waiting for a cue. I poured 2 cups. I offered him one and took my seat across from him. The air between us felt formal, almost ceremonial. He started softly. Ashby had stepped away unexpectedly, leaving things unclear. I nodded. He said he was worried that certain paperwork had been altered without his knowledge. I took a sip of cider, then I opened the drawer and removed a small, neat stack. Clean copies. Not an accusation, just the facts. The new power of attorney. The updated will. Dr. Elkins's letter. The notarized affidavit of capacity. I slid them across to him one at a time. He didn't reach for them. He just looked. I met his eyes, calm, not angry. I told him I had made these decisions for myself, carefully, lawfully. That I knew precisely what I was doing, and that pretending otherwise would not change the reality. His jaw flexed once. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, as if searching for cues, someone else in the house, some sign of a bluff. Then I said a single sentence. Not all silence is weakness. He stood without speaking. Then he gathered the papers, set them back on the table without folding them, and walked out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't add another word. After the engine noise faded down the road, I returned to the table and lifted the napkin holder. I pressed stop on the small recorder tucked beneath. I already had the file name in mind. Quiet confrontation, full clarity. That night I didn't dream of echoing phrases in courthouse corridors, or of Arthur's voice, or of a boy's scraped knees. I dreamt of a room with clean ledgers, labelled boxes, a window open to crisp air. For the first time in years, my choices sat entirely in my hands, and that was enough. The quiet in the house began to change, not through noise, but through presence. Melenie's daughter, Tessa, arrived a little after noon on a bright Saturday. She had a canvas duffel, a laptop bag, and a way of moving through hallways like she'd always belonged there. She wasn't loud. She didn't pry. She set up in the small guest room, plugging in her hard drive, stacking binders, arranging textbooks with effortless order. Tessa studied archival science. Already she spoke with that calm cadence I recognised from my own university days. By evening the house felt different. She offered to make tea and stood in my kitchen as though it were her own. She hummed a soft folk tune while the kettle warmed. Lemon verbena drifted down the hall, bright and green. That night I heard her typing from the guest room, steady, not rushed. The sound reminded me of Arthur's old basement typewriter, long after word processors took over. Anchoring. Over the next few days, Tessa became part of the cadence. She carried out the trash without being asked, printed labels for my old photo albums, asked whether she could digitize years of library notebooks. She handled each thing with care. She didn't try to impress. She simply worked. Originals, clean copies only, the capacity affidavit, the POA, the revised will, transcripts. She moved them onto an encrypted drive, layered backup protocols, and uploaded everything to a university-grade secure cloud. That evening, Grant's name lit my phone. I let it ring. No voicemail. Later, Tessa sat at the dining table and asked whether I wanted to label the garage boxes together in the morning. I said yes. It felt like agreeing to more than cardboard. It felt like saying yes to momentum, to a life that wasn't only defence. Rooms stopped echoing when I walked through them. The kitchen gathered new fingerprints. The floors wanted the broom more often, and I loved it. In my journal, I wrote one line that night. The house is no longer quiet, and neither am I. The next morning, the air had a different edge. The trees outside the window rustled with an easy confidence, as if they understood that something had ended and something else had begun. I sat at my desk with the same journal I'd been filling since Arthur died. The pages were thicker now. Ink, yes, but also certainty. I measured how far I'd come, not in miles or in trophies, but in the deliberate walk back into myself. No grand shouting, no final slam door. Just a stack of small exacting decisions, stones laid on a path only I could draw. I turned to the last page. The pen moved evenly. Let him speak first, then watch him fall. I closed the journal and slipped it into the drawer with Arthur's letter. I tucked the key into my sweater pocket. The kitchen felt warm. Tessa had left early for campus, but her teacup still waited by the sink, steam gone but its memory lingering. I moved through the house at an unhurried pace, trailing fingertips along the wall. The photos were back where they belonged. A small fold in the entry rug showed where her backpack had landed too many times. The hallway lamp flickered once, then settled into a clean glow. Outside, the wind pressed at the panes, gentle and insistent. Leaves turned over, gold on one side, fading green on the other. No announcement. No audience. But I understood. A chapter had closed. Not my story, only the portion where I waited for someone else to declare its shape. And that was enough. If this stayed with you, maybe it's because you felt that same hush, the kind that isn't weakness but survival. If you've ever been overlooked, minimised, or coached to doubt your own sound, let this be your reminder. Dignity doesn't ask permission. You're not alone in your quiet strength. You never were. If this moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts, or for you to simply carry it with you a little longer.